everyone. I'm Farmanfarmian. Today, I'm going to be talking about how AI is completely transforming the healthcare industry. And so here's our agenda. But before I dive into these 5 areas, I want to give you a little bit more background on myself so you understand my point of view. I'm an early stage entrepreneur across pharma, medical device, and AI-based software. The reason I became an entrepreneur is because as a teenager, I was misdiagnosed with an autoimmune disease. All told, I've had 43 hospitalizations, 6 major surgeries, and 3 organs removed. By the time I was 26, this was 7 years after I had my entire large intestine surgically removed. It's in a total colectomy with J-pouch. And I was definitely still very sick. And so I moved out to California, and my new care team was able to diagnose me correctly with Crohn's disease, put me on an IV medication called Remicade, and within 24 hours of that very first dose, I went into full remission. It actually happened overnight. All right, so now that I've shocked everyone, let's talk about the fun stuff, including things like medical devices going into the home. And in fact, location is probably the single biggest barrier to receiving healthcare because it leads to so many follow-on problems. Raise your hands, how many companies in the room need to transport residents to things like doctor's appointments, right? It's very difficult to do a lot of the time. And so once you shift things into the home, you don't worry about healthcare deserts anymore. You don't worry about transportation to a clinic. And in fact, McKinsey did a study, and between this year and next year, they're expecting over $265 billion worth of healthcare services shifting into the home, specifically around the Medicare population and value-based healthcare. So it turns out there are 6 companies that are able to take 30% of all of the revenue in the healthcare industry. That's not mind-blowing, right? 6 companies, 30% of revenue. So here are 3 of those giants. Just looking at these 3, in the past few years, they've spent more than $40 billion buying up large companies like LHC, Landmark, Kindred at Home that provide in-home healthcare, from remote monitoring into the world of even hospitalizations. So whether you are running a senior living facility that is specifically just hospitality, this stuff is going to be happening in the background, and doctors will be able to manage it. Now, looking at these really cool devices, the one that's on the lower left that you see with the 2 fingers, that's the AliveCor 6-lead EKG. It has AI-based software behind the scenes that has cleared the FDA and can actually accurately diagnose people. In fact, I brought the AliveCor with me to a keynote I gave a couple of months ago. One of the gentlemen in the audience, he was in his 70s, and he's like, I spent 2 months going back and forth to clinic visits, doing things like stress tests, and they finally, after 2 months, diagnosed me with atrial fibrillation. I said, we can do it in 30 seconds. And so I took the device, and quite literally 30 seconds later, the device diagnosed him with atrial fibrillation. Right? We are getting that sophisticated. By the way, the reason you care about AFib is because it's typically a silent disease. You have no idea you have it. But if you do, you are 5 to 6 times more likely to have a stroke. Now, the 2 other that you see on the slide, those are wireless, and they are wireless connected and smart. Both of these are a single lead EKG. And because we now have that kind of technology that can sit against the chest, we are able to extrapolate a lot of data from that. In fact, the BioIntelliSense, which is the cute little one in the upper corner, they are taking over 1,400 measurements every day on every patient, right? Big difference from episodic care. Now, the BioBeat is one of my favorites, and the reason is because in addition to that EKG sensor, they also have a PPG sensor. That stands for photoplasmography, and it was commercialized in the 1980s, and it's the way pulse oximeters have always worked. And so we're taking these old sensors, but because of the AI component behind the scenes, again, we can extrapolate a lot of data. And so the BioBeat was the first company that cleared the FDA with cuffless blood pressure monitoring, right? And they're able to do blood pressure continuously, in addition to 12 other vital signs, which means it is taking millions of data points every day on every single patient. Now, this company is super cool. You can download the app for free and use it. This is a company called Together by Renee. Now, this has not cleared the FDA. This is direct-to-consumer. The reason they're going direct-to-consumer is because it costs a lot of money to set up things like clinical trials to get through the FDA. And there are already a ton of companies working on that. And so what they do is you take your smartphone camera, and when you're in a fully lit environment, you stare at the camera for 60 seconds, and it's able to do blood pressure, heart rate, pulse oximetry, and heart rate variability, right? Just through a smartphone camera. Now, by the way, I do use that device sometimes when my nurse takes my blood pressure with the standard cuff method and the stethoscope, and the numbers match, right? So this is actually quite a good app. Now, this is a company called TytoCare. Raise your hands. Anyone heard of TytoCare? Okay, so it launched a couple of years before the pandemic out of Best Buy. I'll talk a little bit about them later on. What this is a video camera with medical device applicators, an otoscope to look in the ears, tongue depressor, and stethoscope. And so instead of going to a clinic, all you do is you call a doctor over video through the app. The doctor can tap into that live video camera feed. And so if I am doing an exam on myself, you can do one on yourself or just have a friend do it. If I had the otoscope in my ear, the doctor can say, hey, Robin, move it a little bit to the right or move it a little bit to the left so she can get a clear view. Now, this can also be done asynchronously, meaning a patient or their caregiver does a full exam with the stethoscope and the tongue depressor, and then a doctor can read the video later on. And in fact, 2 years ago, they cleared the FDA with an AI-based lung sounds analyzer in order to detect things like wheezing. Now, we're also seeing sensors going on to any existing inhaler. What they're doing is they're tracking when, where, how often, and how much medication an individual is using. And a lot of these types of companies also come with a coaching component, which is incredibly beneficial for patients with COPD, because COPD, of course, can be very difficult to manage. Now, there are 3 companies that have cleared the FDA with Parkinson's disease apps. Now, they work either on the Garmin or the Apple Watch. They are tapping into the accelerometer and the gyroscope. And so for the very first time ever, we now can metricize Parkinson's disease involuntary body movements and spasms. Not only that, but that means when someone goes in to see their doctor, the doctor has deep data on the different types of doses that they're taking or medication so that they can actually make a more informed decision for the patient. Now, turns out about 30% of patients with diabetes have a risk of having a foot ulcer. And so this is a company called Siren Care. And like all the rest that I've been talking about beyond that one app, this is covered by Medicare. It's on you do need a prescription, and it's on a subscription model. Now, the way they work is the socks measure the temperature of the bottom of someone's foot. And the reason they're doing that is because they want to catch a hot spot before it breaks through the skin and causes a foot ulcer. Because there are over 150,000 lower limb amputations every year, mostly for patients with diabetes and a foot wound that never healed, which is absolutely heartbreaking. So a pair of socks that can be thrown in the washer and dryer can quite literally help people keep their limbs. Now, we're also seeing companies like Casper. This has gone through the FDA, and it is a sensor for the wall. It works on radar. No video, no audio, no camera. It's tracking micro and macro movements, which means it can see if grandma is sitting up in bed, or if they're walking around, or if they have fallen. Right? But they're also detecting micro skin movements. Every time you breathe and your heart beats, your skin gets a little bit displaced. And so they're able to track that. And from more than 8 feet away, a lot of the time, they're able to do things like heart rate and respiratory rate. And then, of course, that all-important baseline. You really want a baseline on someone's normal behavior so that If there's a slight deviation, you can catch it. Now, raise your hands in the room. How many people have a general idea of their blood pressure? Most people in the room? Okay. How many people have a general idea of their cholesterol level? Okay, about half the room. How many people have a baseline on their brain health? None of us. And that's a big deal. In fact, I asked that question a lot, and the only time there was a conference where a ton of hands went up was at a neurology conference. Now, it turns out 40% of dementia is preventable and even reversible at the early stages. It's through 5 things: diet, exercise, social connection, brain games and critical thinking, and someone's cardiovascular system. Now, it turns out that most people don't go to see a neurologist until their brain, and their memory is getting bad on a daily basis. And if someone's memory is already bad on a daily basis, it's typically too far advanced for pharmaceutical intervention or some of the lifestyle behavior modifications to make a big impact on the disease trajectory. And so this is a company called BrainCheck. Instead of trying to go through the 10 to 14,000 neurologists we have in any given year, and they book out 3, 4, 5 months in advance, they are distributing through primary care. And so it can be done by telemedicine, or a patient can go into the clinic. If they go into the clinic, all the clinic staff has to do is hand them a smart tablet. They've taken the standard neurological exams, and they've gamified them, and they've electronified them. It takes less than 10 minutes to do. In fact, they've got a version for primary care physicians that only takes 3 minutes to do. And this way you can get a baseline on someone's brain health and then catch things if you're doing this type of test multiple times, say 2 or 3 times a year, or even just annually. Now, with all of these devices shifting into the home, right, we are seeing that there is a massive opportunity for data platforms, right? And these platforms can aggregate and integrate wearable tech data and diagnostic data, talk back and forth to the EHR, in addition to doing things like predictive analytics. And so there's a number of companies in this space that I like to keep an eye on. One is Current Health. And the reason I keep an eye on this particular one is because Best Buy, the consumer electronics giant, bought them 2 years ago for $400 million. And with that one giant check, all of a sudden, Best Buy is now a hospital provider. And so it partners up with clinics, and what they do is they go in and they set up remote patient monitoring, or they set up and help with things like a hospitalization at home. And by the way, they send their geek squad in to set up the remote monitoring. Now, another company in this space that I like to watch is Bioformus. Now, not only do they do that remote monitoring as well as the hospitalizations, and they send in nurses no matter where the patient lives, they also do clinical trials at home. And this is a big deal because it turns out about 85% of clinical trials are significantly delayed due to a lack of patient enrollment. And that's the problem, right? Once you pick a geographic location, all of a sudden that pharmaceutical company is only limited to those patients in that nearby vicinity. But by shifting it into the home, all of a sudden, everyone in the US has access to different clinical trials. Now, I gave a keynote at a Bioformus conference last year, so I got to talk to a bunch of the nurses. By the way, in my eyes, any nurses in the audience? Yes? You guys are the angels of the healthcare. Thank you so much for becoming a nurse. Now, the nurses told me about this 78-year-old man who they were doing remote monitoring on. And as part of that, in addition to the tech in the home, they would call him every once in a while. And he was rambunctious, and he was high energy, and he loved to flirt with the nurses. And then they started to notice that his heart rate had slowed a little bit. This is not something any of us would ever notice unless we were continuously taking our heart rate. And they got a little worried, and so they called him. And he was not his normal self, right? He was lethargic, and he was tired, and he didn't interact with the nurses in the way that he normally does. And they got worried, and they're like, okay, we're going to try and adjust your beta blockers, see how that does. Well, it worked for a couple of days, but pretty quickly, they started to see that his heart rate was slowing down a little bit. And so they called him. Again, he was lethargic. So they said, okay, we need you to go get to your clinic now to get checked. Turns out he needed a pacemaker. The way someone like that typically finds out that they need a pacemaker is because they stand up, get dizzy, fall down, break a hip. And as we know, at the age of 78, breaking a hip is a catastrophic injury. Right? And the thing is that most of us would never even notice that we had low heart rates. All right, so let's talk about what's going on in the world of virtual interactivity. Starting with things like the VCR and this is a temperature monitor. Now, raise your hands, how many people had a problem trying to program their VCR, right, for the time check? Right? Those of us who were alive in the 90s and the early 2000s. Well, that's called the blinking 12 problem. And back in the 90s, there was a phrase that everyone used, I can't even set the timer on my VCR. And in fact, that little white one, I have one very similar to my bed. And I was trying to do, change it for the time change about 6 months ago. And while I did that, I accidentally flipped it over to Celsius from Fahrenheit. And I am telling you, 6 months later, I still have no idea how to get it back to Fahrenheit. In fact, it was easier for me to learn Celsius, right? And so we are no longer going to tolerate this type of thing. So looking at companies like Independa, raise your hands, have anyone heard of Independa yet? Cool, all right. So they take your smart TV and turn it into an interactive, experience that is easy for seniors to actually use, right? It's plug and play, essentially. And they can do everything from hearing tests to telemedicine to photo sharing and messages, right? But it really turns that smart TV into something that's very, very easy for a senior to use. Now, raise your hands, how many people have heard of LEQ? Couple, okay. This is a smart speaker, tablet, and video camera, specifically for aging in place. Now, it does things like remote monitoring, it can give you those feedback loops. Grandma can say things like, hey, LEQ, call my son, or hey, LEQ, call my doctor, or hey, LEQ, show me a video on how to take my blood pressure again. And because it's based in machine learning, it actually learns about the patient over time. And so imagine LEQ notices that grandma walks past her every day at 7 a.m. to go and get a cup of tea. If grandma doesn't show up one day, LEQ is going to get worried. She's going to ping grandma, and if there's no response, she's going to ping the pre-programmed care team. Now, this is a really cool company. It turns your upper limb into an actual digital controller. And as you see in the video right now, if someone has some type of a disability, they're able to utilize this to interact with any digital product. Isn't that cool? Now, raise your hands, how many people have tried virtual reality? Okay, about 3/4 of the room. I would say anyone who has not tried high-end virtual reality, definitely go into the Apple Store or go into to another, type of like Best Buy and go try them out, because this is such an incredibly immersive experience. And so this is a company called VirtuLeap, and it's specifically a gym for the mind. It does VR daily training workouts, and it helps with things like memory, attention, flexibility, and even motor control. And instead of going to, say a clinician of some kind and doing boring reps, you are in the world of VR and you're able to do these fun games that you feel like you are transported. Now, raise your hands, how many people have heard of Rendeavor? A couple. All right, so this is a really cool company. What it does is it does positive shared experiences. And as you see, there's a whole bunch of seniors that are doing the pedals, but in the world of virtual reality, they are avatars and they're able to interact with one another, right? Turning exercise into a fun, positive social experience. They also do things like live bingo, as well as traveling, trivia, as well as book clubs. And in fact, you don't have to be sitting next to a bunch of people to do this. You can do it, say, in your own living room, but you can meet up with your friends in the world of virtual reality. Now, they do specifically have this company is enterprise only, so they work with senior living facilities, and usually they limit the VR headsets to about 4, because that's how well that they can handle it. Now, they also are doing customized, personalized reminiscence therapy in virtual reality, which really puts grandma back into the world of, say, 1950 or 1960, if they want to go and do that. Now, this company is super cool. And by the way, most of these are covered by Medicare. Anything that's remote monitoring is also covered by Medicare. But look how cool this is. Instead of trying to do physical therapy like 1, 2, right? Instead, you're doing things like popping balloons or tapping out. And all of a sudden, as I said, it's this immersive environment, taking them out of the senior living facility and into this game world. All right, so raise your hands in the room. How many people have heard the term vocal biomarker? A couple, a few, okay. So this is using a patient's voice as an actual vital sign. And so the lowest hanging fruit in this world is the ability to count the number of times someone coughs on a daily basis. Now, if you think about that for a second, coughing is one of the main things that drives primary care and urgent care. But the problem is no one's ever sat down and tried to count the number of times they cough. In fact, if someone has, say, advanced, like a COPD, right? Turns out they can cough hundreds, if not over 1,000 times a day. And so just by tracking the number of times someone coughs is a game changer. But this company in particular, it's Hife, and it's one of about 15 companies I'm aware of in this space. Hife is also able to categorize coughs into things like a whooping or a wheezing or a productive cough, because the way a cough sounds is both an indication of the problem, but also what treatment will work for that individual. Now, turns out we have about 2 million hospitalizations and ER visits due to COPD. Just tracking the number of times someone coughs on a daily basis and the time of day they are coughing will predict a COPD exacerbation 3 days before someone would typically go to the hospital. Now, ellipsis is really cool. This is a clinically validated vital sign for mental health. It works in the background. The patient does not need to do anything at all. And this is used both in telemedicine as well as clinic visits. And it is analyzing someone's speech, and they only need a small amount, maybe 60 seconds, in order to score them around anxiety, stress, and depression. Now, in fact, ellipsis is so good that it can replace the PHQ-8, the patient health questionnaire of 8 questions that a clinician would typically give to a patient to determine their mental health status. Now, Cambridge Cognition is super cool. In addition to a ton of digital tests in the world of neurology, they acquired a company called Winterlight Labs. And those Winterlight has a number of different conditions that they track, specifically through a patient's voice. And again, it's like 60 seconds or around there. They are able to detect aphasia with 100% accuracy and Alzheimer's with 82% accuracy. Now, Sond is pretty cool. They've partnered up with Together by Renee, which is that company where you can take your blood pressure using the smartphone camera. Now, while Cambridge Cognition and Winterlight are extracting about 500 different vocal biomarkers or data, Sond had identified early on 4,000 unique features to the human voice. Now, in this particular example, you can go on Together by Renee, and you can do a voice test to get a mental fitness score. And as you see, it really scores around those 8 different parameters. And you can do this on a daily basis to really track your own mental health over time. All right, how's everyone doing? You guys are good? Is this new information for a lot of you? Yes, all right, I love when I can tell you some stuff that you didn't know beforehand. All right, so let's talk about some of the healthcare services shifting into the patient's home. In fact, Humana and Medicare started making a pretty big push to do dialysis in the home a couple of years before the pandemic. Turns out that patients are surviving 3 times longer when they get dialysis at home instead of going to a dialysis clinic. Right? That's the equivalent of a kidney transplant, which is incredible to think about. And there's a reason why. Of course, our kidneys don't work just 3 hours a day, 3 times a week when we get, dialysis. Now, this is my living room, where I get the vast majority of my healthcare either in my living room or within a 3 or 4 block radius, because proximity matters. Make it easy for a patient to do, and it's much more likely to get done. Now, I've been on Remicade now for over 20 years. First 15 years, I got it done in normal hospital infusion clinics. Let me tell you, I'd walk in and there'd be, say, 15 other patients all on IV meds, which means there's always an alarm bell going off. And I would be there for 3 or 4 hours, listening almost the entire time to high-pitched beeping. I'd go home and I would be shaking, and my entire body would hurt from head to toe. And I just assumed that's the price I had to pay for being on a medication that put my Crohn's into remission. Well, about 7 years ago, my insurance company said, "Hey, Robin, you want to stay on Remicade? You're going to have to get it done in the home." I was like, "You're just telling me this now?" I would have been doing it in the home the entire time. And so there are a lot of companies right now that do in-home IV medication. I use Option Care, which is able to cover about 90% of the US. They ship the medication to me using FedEx on ice. I throw it in my refrigerator, and then I text back and forth with my nurse to schedule her to come into the home, which is exactly the way most of us now like to communicate, is by text. So she comes in, she mixes the medication on site, and then infuses it to me. My recovery time went from a pretty hardcore 7 days to a 0 to maybe a mild 1 to 2 days, just by changing the patient's environment. I wasn't reacting to the medication. I was reacting to that environment. Now, of course, my insurance company didn't think of this. It's not something we typically think about in the world of pharma, right? Where you get your medication impacts how well or the side effects someone experiences. They were doing it because of cost. My hospital was charging $28,000 just for the medication. Option Care charges $2,500. Since I get this 8 times a year, that comes out to a difference in billing over a 5-year period of $1 million. Yeah. So while my nurse is in my apartment to give me my Remicade, she also draws my blood labs and then just drops them off at the nearest LabCorp or Quest. But there are a lot of companies who will just come in and do blood draws for you. Raise your hands, has anyone heard of Get Labs yet? Okay, a couple. So Get Labs they charge anywhere from $50 to $100 depending on how far they need to travel. And that's out of pocket, but then everything they do is going to be covered by Medicare. And so they can do the blood labs and drop them off at the LabCorp or the Quest. They can do vital signs. They can do things like X-ray, ultrasound, and even bone density scans. Now, the thing I like the most is this retinal scan. Now, raise your hands, how many people have tried to get into an ophthalmologist and they were booking out like 3, 4, 5 months in advance? Right? Yeah. In fact, mine was so difficult to schedule and they were looking at 4 to 5 months in the future that I finally just pulled my care and went to a high-end optometrist who has, the top machines now. And so being able to scan someone's retina is a very big deal. Turns out there are patients with diabetes, right? Diabetic retinopathy is responsible for the most number of preventable blindness, right? Diabetic retinopathy is preventable, but you actually have to get tested for it. And so bringing this to the senior can mean the difference between them being able to see or them going blind. We're also seeing urgent care going into the home with companies like Dispatch Health. And they're available in different parts of the country right now. But if you need something like stitches, or you need a basic diagnosis, or you need something like IV hydration, right? These are the kind of companies that come to the patient and you don't have to worry about going into urgent care. All right, let's roll it out with the world of generative AI. And so I remember Ron asked the audience yesterday how many people had played around with ChatGPT. So raise your hands, how many people have done generative AI? Okay, raise your hands. How many people are using it in their job? Awesome, that is amazing. So you understand the power. Now, the big thing about generative AI is, of course, it is able to understand context. And so this example really hits that home. It's a company called Be My Eyes, and they're about 9 years old or so right now. They're for patients who are blind or who have low vision. And so what this company does is it has millions, in fact, volunteers all over the world. And if someone needs help, all they do is they have a video call, and the person, wherever they are in the world, is able to help the individual who is blind, whether that's cooking, going to the bus, or what have you. Well, when GPT 4.0 launched, they plugged it in immediately behind the scenes, and they were able to replace some of their volunteers. And so the way it works is, imagine I'm standing in front of my refrigerator. I can take a picture of the inside of the refrigerator, and the generative AI will say things like, hey, Robin, the milk is in the upper right-hand corner, and the butter is right in front of you, and the bread and the cheese are both in the lower left. Not only that, they can do things like, by the way, your milk, it's expiring in 5 days. Now, in addition to just automatically being able to tell me what's in my refrigerator, it will also suggest a number of recipes that can be made using that food. That doesn't give you, heart flutters. The fact that the AI needed to understand that human beings eat, we have food that goes into a refrigerator, we pull that out and we mix it up in a certain way and then we eat it. The fact that generative AI is able to understand that context with no extra programming whatsoever. But the big thing in the world of healthcare are these AI-based medical scribes. Raise your hands, how many people have seen an AI-based medical scribe yet? Couple, okay, cool. What they are doing is typically they auto-transcribe the entire clinic visit, auto-summarize. They're able to write out things like prescriptions and things like prior authorizations. And in fact, a couple of years ago, United spent 13 million hours just on prior authorizations, right? And so there's some rules, that are going through the government right now, which makes prior authorizations much faster to be able to get. But of course, generative AI is able to write that first draft and can dramatically cut down that time. Now, all of the examples in the world of generative AI still require what's called a human in the loop. There's many reasons for this, but what these are you have to think of them as rough drafts. And when you look at the summary, you have to read over the entire summary and say, yes, this is good to go, whether it goes to the patient or, say, the insurance company. Now, there are a lot of large language models. In fact, most of us hadn't heard the term large language model until about 2 years ago. Well, now there are over 150, including Facebook's Llama, which can be used in the world of healthcare. Google has one called Gemini, and Microsoft. Now, had you asked me 10 years ago if Microsoft would be one of the biggest dominating companies in the world of healthcare, I might have picked Google or Apple over Microsoft. But no, Microsoft has gone all in the world of generative AI. In fact, they bought a company called Nuance a couple of years ago for $19 billion. In addition, they invested $11 billion into OpenAI, which means they have put a $40 billion bet across 2 companies, and that does not even count what they are doing internally. Right? Now, some of these large language models are HIPAA compliant. For the ones that are not, the way you can get around that is OpenAI has a way of anonymizing data. And so it can anonymize the patient data and then go through and transcribe it and summarize it and turn it into reports or prior authorizations without worrying about HIPAA compliance. Now, this is a company called Nabla, but I wanted to show you only because it's just such a beautiful user interface, right? It's able to do those types of summaries in seconds. Now, this company is based in France, but they actually have launched mostly here in the United States. And they are doing a big test right now with about 10,000 clinicians in Northern California who work for Kaiser Permanente. Now, Epic. They already built in a native medical scribe. and they've launched inside of Emory. And this is early days in this kind of technology, but they are seeing that clinicians are saving 70 hours a month. This is mind-blowing. Once a clinician uses something like an AI-based medical scribe and gets those 70 hours back to themselves a month, do you really think they are ever going to work for a corporation that doesn't use generative AI? Now, LifeLoop is super cool, and I actually think they're here. Raise hands, is LifeLoop here? There, Joey? Yes, nice. And so this is a really cool application of generative AI. What they're able to do is in seconds create an activity calendar. Not only that, but it will pre-populate things like materials needed, whether that are, say, yoga mats or VR headsets. And they can even personalize activities based on the individual's likes and dislikes. Raise your hands, how many people spend a lot of time on their activity calendars, right? This is something that's extremely time-consuming. Oh, there is one other aspect that they do that's really cool. They do travel, and so they're able to have someone, say, on the ground in Paris or in Rome, and then the residents can interact with that individual who's giving them a tour of another country. Now, last year, you might have heard about this lawyer. What he did is he went on ChatGPT and asked it to write a legal brief for him. And then he just sent it off to the judge. Well, it turns out all 6 court cases that were in that legal brief were completely made up, right? Absolute fiction. In the world of large language models, we call this a hallucination. But I would argue that hallucinations are not a bug, they are a feature, because generative AI does just that. Generates new content that doesn't exist anywhere else. And so while this is hilarious, right, when it happens to an attorney, this is the kind of thing that can absolutely not happen in the world of healthcare. And that's why we're seeing companies like Cahoon. What they're able to do is they put a knowledge graph on top of a large language model. This also can be called a certified layer of data. And so the large language model comes to the table, having gone to medical school. It has an engineering degree, it has a law degree, it got a business degree. It's been trained on all of Wikipedia and a huge amount of the internet. But then it gets filtered up through this small knowledge graph on top. And in fact, these certified layers of data can be hundreds of pages, right? It's a very small amount of data that it can get filtered up through. And why this is so important is because now a clinician can tap on their recommendations and see all of the sources and all of the reasoning behind why they think John Smith has diagnosis A and diagnosis B, right? So all of a sudden, it becomes much more transparent. All right, so here are your takeaways. First and foremost, healthcare is shifting out of clinics and into a patient's home, whether they live at a senior living facility or at their normal home. This is happening, right? You don't even need to be on board with this to happen behind the scenes. Secondly, we are seeing entirely new ways to measure health, either from things like radar on the wall or things like vocal biomarkers. And lastly, tech is changing our expectations on how we interact with our healthcare system, right? We are no longer going to tolerate trying to program our VCR clock, right? It's always the fault of the company if the user interface and the user experience aren't perfect, right? If it's not easy and fun and intuitive to use, the company needs to go back to the drawing board. And with that, I will say thank you.